Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into something a lot of you are clearly passionate about, learning English effectively. And for this deep dive, you've brought us some super interesting material from the English Globe podcast to really get into it.
Yeah, it's cool how the English Globe manages to bridge, the classic ways of learning English with all the new tech and methods out there. Let's unpack what really makes their approach work and how it can apply to you.
Okay, so one of the things that jumped out at me was how much they emphasized immersion. Like they didn't just mention it, they really drilled it home. Why do you think that is?
It's really fascinating because if you think about it, that's how we pick up our first language, right? By being surrounded by it constantly. And that's what the English Globe suggests. Replicate that as much as possible. Even little things like switching your phone to language settings can make a difference.
Right, like tricking your brain into thinking English is everywhere. And they also talked a lot about daily practice. Everyone always says practice makes perfect, but the English Globe seemed to have a particular take on it.
Totally, yeah. They're all about consistency over intensity. So instead of cramming in a huge study session once a week, they suggest finding just 15 minutes each day to focus on one specific thing.
That's so much less intimidating than I imagined. It seems like they're really into using tech as a tool, too. I mean, with all the apps and resources available these days, it can feel overwhelming. Any specific recommendations from the English Globe that stood out?
There are definitely some gems in there. Apps like Duolingo or Babbel are awesome for like bite-sized learning on the go.
Yeah.
But the important thing is remembering they're just supplements, not replacements. They're great additions to your learning plan, but shouldn't be the entire plan, if that makes sense.
So finding that balance between the cool, quick stuff and deeper learning. And speaking of learning, I loved how they talked about making mistakes. They almost seem to encourage it.
Totally. The English Globe frames mistakes as feedback, not failures. They really emphasize seeing them as opportunities to learn and grow, which takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
Instead of getting discouraged, you can use mistakes to figure out where you need more practice.
Definitely takes the pressure off. Makes it all feel less like a test and more like, I don't know, an adventure. Okay, so we've got immersion, consistent practice, embracing those inevitable slip-ups, and using tech wisely. Anything else big from the English Globe so far?
Oh yeah, one of the most empowering things the English Globe emphasizes is personalization. They really drive home the point that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So what excites you about learning English? Let that passion guide you.
That's awesome. It's like they're saying, hey, this is your adventure, make it your own. And they also talked a lot about real world practice, right? Like actually talking to people.
Exactly. The English Globe highlighted finding a language partner or joining some kind of language exchange program as a super cool way to do that.
Yeah, I remember them talking about the benefits of actually interacting with native or fluent English speakers.
Right. It's like taking your learning from textbooks to the streets, having real conversations. Think about it. It gives you direct feedback on your pronunciation, helps with listening, and can even be a great way to connect with other cultures.
That sounds a bit nerve-wracking at first, though. Did the English Globe give any tips on finding a language partner or how to navigate those first few conversations?
Yeah, actually they did. And what's cool is they emphasized it doesn't have to be super formal or intimidating.
Yeah.
It could be as simple as just having a casual chat with someone who's also learning.
That makes it much more approachable. So just to recap what we've got from the English Globe so far. Immersion, consistent practice, using tech the right way, not being afraid of making those mistakes, and finding what works for you. Oh, and of course, taking that leap to actually use the language with a partner. Did I get everything?
You nailed it. It's amazing how the English Globe brings these would seem like simple strategies together into a personalized learning plan that's actually powerful. It's not about some magical shortcut. It's about finding what clicks for you and consistently using these steps.
Before we get into the next part of the English Globe, I'm curious, what's resonated most with you so far? What's got you thinking, I should try that?
Honestly, what stands out for me is their focus on celebrating those little wins. It's so easy to get caught up in reaching fluency and feel overwhelmed by the journey. But the English Globe is all about appreciating those small steps forward.
I love that. It's like giving yourself permission to enjoy the process, not just the destination. And speaking of the journey, the English Globe didn't shy away from the challenges of staying motivated, right?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
They had some really insightful tips on things like setting realistic goals and finding ways to keep things fun and engaging. But I think we should save that juicy stuff for part 2 of our deep dive. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We've got so much more to uncover from the English Globe, and I can't wait to see what other gems they have in store for us.
So before we took a little break, we were talking about those small wins
Yeah.
and how important it is to acknowledge them as you learn English.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? I think so many of us get so focused on like the big goal of being fluent that we kind of forget to appreciate those little victories along the way. Did the English Globe have any specific advice for setting those smaller goals?
They're really big on breaking down, those big ambitious goals like becoming fluent into much smaller, more manageable steps.
Yeah.
Almost like when you plan a road trip, right? You wouldn't just set off without a map or those stops along the way.
Oh, totally. I can see how that makes the whole thing less overwhelming and you get those feelings of accomplishment as you go. Did they give any examples of what those smaller goals could be?
Yeah, they did. They said instead of, I don't know, aim to be fluent in a month, which is kind of unrealistic for most people, focus on mastering a specific grammar point, or maybe learning 10 new words every week, or even being able to hold a 5-minute conversation about something specific.
Okay, so things you can actually track and measure, which is super motivating. But even with realistic goals, don't you think people kind of hit a wall sometimes? They lose that initial excitement. Did the English Globe talk about that at all?
Yeah, they had a pretty interesting take on that. They said one of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to force themselves into a learning style that just doesn't work for them.
Mm.
Like, you know, trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It's not going to work.
So how do you even figure out what does work for you? Was there any guidance on that from the English Globe?
Oh, they had some good tips. They suggested people think about how they learn best in other areas of life. Are you a visual person, someone who loves flashcards and diagrams? Or do you learn more by listening and repeating things, like with podcasts or audio lessons? Or maybe you're more hands-on and you really need to use the language in real situations to get it.
I never thought about it like that, but it makes so much sense, right? If you enjoy learning, you're going to stick with it. Any other advice from the English Globe on keeping things fun and engaging?
One thing that really stuck with me was their idea of connecting your passions with your learning. It's like, don't just study English, experience it.
I love that. What kind of experiences did they have in mind?
Oh, they had tons of creative
Mm.
ideas. Like if you're really into music, try listening to English songs and figuring out the lyrics.
Mm.
Or if you love cooking, follow some English language cooking channels. Fashion, check out English fashion magazines or websites.
That's so smart. It's almost like making it part of your life, not just something you have to do.
Exactly. And by using things you're already interested in, you're more likely to stay motivated. They even suggested turning like your daily commute into an English immersion experience by listening to podcasts or audiobooks.
Okay, so we've got setting those realistic goals, figuring out your learning style, and making it feel like a natural part of your life, not this separate stressful thing.
Yeah.
Anything else that the English Globe emphasized?
They're also really big on understanding that, learning a language is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, maybe times you get frustrated and think about giving up. But what's important is remembering why you started in the first place,
Yeah.
you know, and just keep moving forward step by step.
It's like they say, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Every step gets you closer, even the small one.
Exactly. And the English Globe reminded listeners that they don't have to go it alone. There's this huge community of English learners out there, everyone facing similar things and celebrating those same victories.
Yeah, they mention online forums, language exchange groups, even local meetups where you can connect with other learners.
Right. It's a chance to, I don't know, share tips and strategies, get a little encouragement when you need it, and just have fun with people who get what you're going through. Makes the whole experience less lonely and more like a shared journey.
So to recap what we've covered so far from the English Globe: immersion, consistent practice, leveraging tech, not being afraid of mistakes, finding what works for you, and connecting with other learners. What stood out to you as especially insightful?
What's cool is how the English Globe brings all these like seemingly different pieces together into one big approach to learning, right? It's not just about memorizing grammar and words, it's about creating a learning experience that really fits you and what you want to get out of it.
And they really emphasize how learning English opens up a whole world of possibilities, like connecting with other cultures, accessing information that was out of reach before, and even improving your career.
For sure. It's so much more than just learning a language. It's about expanding your horizons.
I love that. It makes the whole journey seem much more rewarding. There's one thing that I think a lot of people, especially those who are just starting out, struggle with: pronunciation. Did the English Globe have any advice on that?
Well, they did. And they acknowledged that pronunciation can be one of the hardest things to master, but also really rewarding. They talked about this technique called shadowing. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, the term rings a bell, but I'm not sure what it actually means. Can you break it down for us?
So basically, shadowing is when you listen to like a recording of a native speaker and try to imitate their pronunciation as closely as you can. It's almost like you're their shadow, hence the name.
So you're not just passively listening, you're actively trying to reproduce the sounds they make, the rhythm, the intonation, all that.
Exactly. And the English Globe suggested using things like podcasts, audiobooks, even movies or TV shows for this. It's a really good way to train your ear and your mouth to work together and start getting those subtle things in English pronunciation.
Cool. Did they mention any other techniques or resources for improving pronunciation?
They talked about how important it is to pay attention to the rhythm and intonation of English. It's not just about pronouncing each word perfectly in isolation, but understanding how they flow together in a sentence, where the emphasis is, how the pitch changes.
Yeah, I've noticed sometimes native speakers stress different parts of a word than I would, and it can completely change the meaning.
Right. And the English Globe recommended using online dictionaries that have audio pronunciations and even pronunciation apps that can give you feedback on your speech. It's pretty amazing how tech has made it so much easier to work on pronunciation these days.
Getting that immediate feedback would be super helpful. I can see that. So we've got shadowing, focusing on the rhythm and intonation, and using technology. What other pronunciation tips did they offer?
One thing that really resonated with me was them saying, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
That's how we learn and get better, right? They encourage people to record themselves speaking English, listen back, and find areas they need to work on. And then, of course, just practice, practice, practice.
That's such good advice. It's easy to get stuck in your head about pronunciation, but in the end, the best way to get better is just to speak, even if it's not perfect at first.
Totally. And they were really good at reminding listeners that pronunciation, just like any other part of learning a language, is a journey, not a sprint. It takes time and effort, but it's worth it in the end.
It sounds like the English Globe has covered a ton already, from the basics of immersion and practice to those finer points of pronunciation. Did they talk about any other, really challenging parts of learning English?
They did. And one that's super important, especially as you get more fluent, is understanding cultural context. They really emphasize that learning a language isn't just about grammar and vocab. It's also about understanding those cultural norms, values, and customs that shape how language is actually used.
I can see how that would be crucial to avoid misunderstandings and really connect with native speakers on a deeper level, right?
Right. They had some really interesting examples like idioms and slang, which can be tough if you don't understand the culture they come from. Like, for example, they talked about the idiom kick the bucket. Literally, it means to hit a bucket with your foot, but in English, it means to die. It's kind of a dark humor thing.
Wow, that's a great example. I can imagine how confusing that would be if you didn't get the cultural meaning behind it. Did they give any tips on how to navigate those tricky cultural nuances?
Oh, they did. They suggested really immersing yourself in English-speaking cultures as much as possible. Watch movies and TV shows, read books, listen to music, even travel to English-speaking countries if you can.
That sounds awesome. It's like taking your learning beyond textbooks and experiencing the language as it's really used.
Exactly. They also talked about nonverbal communication, like body language and gestures, which can be super different across cultures. They gave the example of giving a thumbs up, which is usually a good thing in Western cultures, but can actually be offensive in some parts of the Middle East and Asia.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've had some awkward moments traveling because I didn't understand local customs.
It happens.
Mm.
It's easy to accidentally offend someone if you don't know the cultural differences. But the English Globe was really good at emphasizing that it's all part of the learning process. The more you expose yourself to different cultures, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
So, on top of everything else, the English Globe is telling us to be cultural explorers as well as language learners.
Absolutely. They really drove home that language and culture are super connected, and understanding one helps you understand the other.
I'm really starting to see how the English Globe has this holistic approach to learning English. It's not just about the words themselves, it's about the culture, the communication, the connection. Pretty inspiring. There's one more big thing we should probably address, and that's standardized tests.
Ah, yes, the tests. TOEFL, Ielts, all those exams that can make even confident English learners sweat a little.
Exactly. Did the English Globe have any wisdom to share for those facing the dreaded test prep?
They did. And they had a really practical and reassuring perspective, which was great. First off, they said it's super important to understand the format of the test and the types of questions you're likely to see.
No going in blind. Sounds like they're big on research and knowing what to expect.
Exactly. That way, you can just focus on using your English skills to the best of your ability. They were also really into using official test prep materials, like practice tests and study guides. You can usually find them online or at test prep centers.
Basically, practice like you play, right? Get familiar with the format, timing, those types of questions. Did they have any other test-taking tips?
They talked about time management, which is like super important for any standardized test. They recommended practicing with a timer so you can get used to the pace of the exam and learn how to use your time wisely. And of course, they stressed staying calm and focused during the test.
Easier said than done, right? Especially when you're under all that pressure. Did they have any tips for, like, dealing with test anxiety?
Oh, they did. And this was really important. They reminded people that these tests are just one way to measure your English skills. They don't define you as a learner or a person.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in needing a certain score, but at the end of the day, it's just a number.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the English Globe urged people to keep that in mind. Remember, your language learning journey goes way beyond any standardized test.
It seems like they're all about finding that joy in learning, regardless of the challenges. But I think it's time we shift gears a bit and talk about how to put all this great advice from the English Globe into action.
Totally. We've covered a lot, from immersion and pronunciation to culture and test prep. Now we need to figure out how you, our listener, can take all of this and use it to reach your own goals, right?
Absolutely. But I think we need a little more time to really get into that. Should we continue this in part 3 of our deep dive?
Yeah, that's a great idea. We'll give our listeners a chance to think about everything we've talked about so far, and then we can come back and create a personalized English learning roadmap.
Sounds good. See y'all in part 3.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. We've been unpacking all this awesome advice from the English Globe podcast, and in this final part, it's time to, actually put it all into action.
Exactly. We've covered so much from like embracing mistakes to figuring out cultural stuff. It's been quite the journey. But now the question is, how can you use all this to reach your English language goals? That's the big question, right? And where do we even start? It can feel kind of overwhelming with so many different options out there.
Well, the English Globe was really big on this idea that there's no single way to learn that works for everyone. It's about finding what works for you, your style, what you want to get out of it.
Okay, so like step 1 is asking yourself, what do I want out of this?
Right. Exactly. Like, what are your motivations? What's the hardest part for you? What resources do you have? It's kind of like before you cook something, you check your ingredients, right? See what you've got and what you want to make.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say someone's really into that idea of immersion. What would be a good first step for them?
If you're all about immersion, think about like how to bring more English into your daily life. Could you switch your phone settings to English or your social media? Maybe start watching movies with English subtitles, or even just listen to music or podcasts while you're doing other stuff.
It's about making English a part of your everyday routine, even in small ways.
Exactly. And don't forget about consistency. Just 15, 20 minutes every day can really make a difference in the long run.
And what about all those language learning apps and websites? Where do those fit in?
No, the English Globe was really excited about how tech can help us learn. Apps like Duolingo, Babbel, Memrise. They have tons of exercises, vocab stuff, even pronunciation practice. But, and this is important, they were really clear that those should be additions to your learning plan, not the whole plan itself.
Yeah, it's like, having a personal trainer versus just using a fitness app. They both have their place.
Right. And let's not forget about actually talking to people. Find a language partner, join a group, maybe even take an online class with a real teacher.
They were really big on the benefits of actually speaking with others, right?
For sure. Talking with people, even if it's just a few minutes each week, can make a huge difference in your confidence and fluency. And honestly, it's way more fun than just staring at a book.
And of course, we can't forget their advice to, embrace those mistakes.
Absolutely. They saw mistakes as like feedback, chances to learn. Don't be afraid to try new things, experiment, and mess up a little bit.
It takes the pressure off for sure. It reminds you that learning a language is a journey, not some kind of performance where you have to be perfect all the time.
Exactly. And something else the English Globe kept saying was that there's no one right way to learn. It's about finding what you're passionate about and letting that drive your learning, you know? Like if you love music, listen to English songs and try to sing along. Or if you're a movie buff, watch your favorites in English with subtitles.
Makes it feel less like a chore and more like something you actually want to do.
Right. And for those times when you feel like giving up, remember what they said about celebrating those small achievements?
It's all about recognizing those little steps forward.
Every new word you learn, every conversation you have, every time you understand a little more, those are all wins. Celebrate them.
And be patient with yourself, right?
Definitely. Learning takes time. There will be tough moments, but always keep in mind why you started. What are you working towards?
And you don't have to do this alone. There are so many people learning English out there, all going through the same things, celebrating the same victories.
It's true. Connect with other learners online at meetups. Share tips, encourage each other, and just have fun with it.
This has been amazing. The English Globe has given us so much to think about, so many tools to help us on our journey to learn English.
They've really shown how learning a language can be so much more than just like studying. It's about connecting with people, seeing new things, and becoming, well, a better version of yourself.
I love that. So to everyone listening, take that first step, accept the challenge, and start this journey. You've got this. And with a little help from the English Globe, we're confident you can reach your goals and open up a whole new world of possibilities.
Until next time, everyone, happy